Okay, guys, we're back to talk about a couple of things, a couple of jQuery methods that I think you've seen before, but I don't know that if we've explicitly talked about them. But I don't believe we've really done much of an example um, of these functions. So the first one that you need to be aware of is the attribute method here, the attr. And let me just show you what that method is all about. You can read that, by the way. If you go to W3 Schools jQuery page, down at the bottom under references HTML/CSS, there's a section there on the attribute method, and with some examples and how you might use that. But I'm going to use our Ian Boardshop site just to kind of show you, what you might do with that particular function. And so what I've done is I basically inspected this element here, this image, the Arbor Ethos Women's image. And so here's the actual image tag associated with that. And if you remember in HTML, what we call each of these values here, where you have like source equals something and then width equals something, those are all called attributes. So this attr method is a way for you to retrieve those values, okay? So let's see, there's not really a good way for us, a way that you know yet to get a hold of that one. So let's do something else. Let's look at how about the go button there? All right, so the go button, we've got an ID associated with that. And we've got various attributes in here. So I can actually get those fairly easily using jQuery. So I'm going to select that element using its ID. So $, open parentheses, quote, £, to say I'm referring to the ID, and then I put the ID name in there, close my parentheses, and I want to get the attribute, and it's already given me some options for that. We'll get the title attribute there, okay? So we can see what the title says. So we can already see from the code up here that the title says go button, but here's a way for me to retrieve that programmatically. So if I run that code, sure enough, it returns the string go button. And the attribute function also lets me set those values if I want to. So for example, our button up here says go, right? That's what the value is for that. And so if I were to get the attribute value, we would see that the value of it is the word go, right? The string go, but I could actually set that value by calling the attribute function, and I say I want to retrieve the value attribute, which says I want to retrieve this one here, and I want to overwrite the value that's there and set it to something new. So instead of go, since this is a search button, maybe we want to set it to say search. If I hit enter there and we look up here, when I do that, I'll look up there, and sure enough, it changes my search button to now say search. And we can see here in the code that it actually did that. It updated the value to be search. So accessing those attribute values or setting those attribute values are something that can be very useful. It's something that could be very useful and for you to do programmatically. So jQuery makes that really easy, right? So the other thing that you need to be aware of, particularly for this next homework assignment in jQuery, is the each method. And again, I think we've seen this before. But the each method is basically if you go to the jQuery section of W3 Schools and go down here to jQuery miscellaneous, right down here almost at the bottom of the page, they've got some miscellaneous functions that are useful. And one of those functions is the each function. All right, and so what each allows you to do is if you have a list of a list of elements that you've selected, you can run some code on each of those elements, right? So this is useful whenever your jQuery selector returns more than one item, all right? So, so let's just show you a quick example of that. I'm going to, these images here, if we look at these, we see that they are all of class board picks, okay? So if I were to do this selector, whoops, let me do dot, which says that I'm selecting everything with that class. If I were to do that and say, like we learned how to set the CSS border. So if I were to do that, right now they've got a CSS border of that's black. If I were to pass into that, for the border CSS property, we're going to set it to be solid 1 pix, and it's going to be red instead. So if I do that and I run that code, it did not work. Why did that not work? Let me see. I'm not sure what I did wrong there. Solid 1 pix red. That looks like it should have worked. Let's try something. Board pix. Let's do this. Let's just see if I hide all of these guys, if it hides them. Yep, it did. It hid all those images. Let's show them again. So I think maybe the CSS that I've got defined for that border is overriding the value that I'm trying to set it to. Did I do something else wrong? Let me look at that one more time. Board pix, and I say I want to set the CSS of that, the border property, to be solid 1 px red. Oh, there it goes. I don't know what I did wrong last time, something. But anyway, so I set the border to red 1 pixel wide for each of those pictures, right? So that works fine if you're trying to, for everything with that class, every single element that matches that's using that class, set the border. But what if instead, what if I maybe only wanted to set the border for every image that's using that class, right? But if it's got a source attribute, we just figured out how to grab the attribute of something. If it's got a source attribute that begins with the letter A, instead of setting its border to red, we want to set its border to blue, okay? So how would we do that? Well, each will give us the ability to do that. So let's try it using this each function. So again, I'm going to select everything that's using the board pix class, okay? And let's set it back to what it was before. It was previously black, and I think like it was 2 pixels wide, maybe. All right, so that's what it looked like originally. So now I'm going to select everything that's board, that's got that class, and for each of those guys, I'm going to run a function on it. Okay, we kind of use this same syntax whenever we're trying to do things like if you click on a particular button, right, run this function. So for each of those guys, we're going to run this function. Oh, I hit my enter key. I did it again, hit enter too soon. All right, let me hit shift enter there. And so for each of those, what I want to do is I want to see if the source attribute begins with the letter A, all right? Now, I'm going to put some things together for us. We're going to use the attribute function. I'm also going to use the index of string function that we saw in a previous video, right? And so I'm going to say if for this particular item, the one that I'm currently on as I'm going through each of these elements in the list, right? So the first time it runs through this, executes the function, it's going to be on this image. The next time it's going to be on this image. The next time it's going to be on this image, because those are all of the elements that have that class board pix, right? So that's what this corresponds to. Each time it goes to a different one, it's like a for each loop or for loop. Every time it goes to the next one, the $ parentheses this is going to refer to that particular one, right? So if for this element, the attribute has the attribute source, the attribute source has, so that's going to return, in this case, arbor annex mens. If that attribute source, the string that's returned from that has an index of the index of the letter A, capital A, if that is equal to 0. Okay, so that's telling us that if the attribute source begins with the letter A, right? Because the index of the letter A is right there at the very beginning. All right, if that is the case for each of those elements, I'm going to go ahead and close my if statement so I don't forget to do that. For each of those, what I'm going to do for this particular one, if that's the case, I'm going to set the border, the CSS border, to solid 2px blue. All right. And we could put an else statement if we wanted to, and we could do red on all the rest like we had done before. Otherwise, else, I'll just copy this line here, get on here. We're going to set it to a border of red. All right, so let's run that and see what happens. So check that out. For everything that started with the letter A, everything that had an image that started with the letter A, which would have been Arbor Annex and Arbor Ethos, it sets the border to blue. But for all of the other ones, it set the border to red. So that's really useful. And so I'd recommend reading about each. Each is almost always used with this keyword, and they show you that here in this example. But I'll send you the links to that so you guys can play around with that. But that's going to be crucial when we're doing the search, fixing our search box up, right? When I'm looking here and say, show me everything that is Burton, right? What I'm expecting you to do is look at each of the items and see which of them have an attribute that has the word Burton in it. And then if it doesn't have Burton, then we're going to hide the one, that particular element, right? So that's a little clue on how you might achieve that. All right, that's it for this one. And we've got one more lesson coming, so you'll be able to do this week's homework.